Welcome to the 10th video on the Literature and Publishing course, the third-year core course for students of English literature at the University of Greenwich. This is the first video on a pair of detectives, one very well known today and the other far less so, but I think equally interesting. We've already covered the beginnings of modern detective fiction with Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue from 1842, followed by an example of sensation fiction where detecting looms very large, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Henry Dunbar. That was published over 1863-4, and you can find the videos on them easily enough with a quick search for Detective Fiction Greenwich. We move on now to perhaps the most famous detective of them all, Sherlock Holmes, a character invented by Arthur Conan Doyle, later Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and the first of his adventures in the Strand magazine, A Scandal in Bohemia. But we'll also be looking at a story which is far less well known, Matched, from The Adventures of Judith Lee, written by Richard Marsh and published, like The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, in the Strand magazine, but 20 years later. Matched appeared in November 1911, whereas A Scandal in Bohemia had appeared in July 1891. Remember those dates. They will come back to haunt us. Now, I chose Matched because in many ways it's a complement to A Scandal in Bohemia. In both, the object of detection is a sexualized woman who escapes the detective and who remains at the end ultimately illegible and untraceable and undetectable. Though in both cases, the two women certainly leave very marked traces. But in Richard Marsh's Matched, as you already have guessed from the series title, The Adventures of Judith Lee, the detective is herself a woman. How much of a difference does this regendering of the detective make? We'll certainly be thinking about that. Now, in the very first of these videos, I wanted to let you know that this isn't a conventional course on detective fiction, in the sense that it traces a canon of great detectives. While it doesn't ignore the canonical detective like Agatha Christie's Poirot or Dorothy Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey, and this video about Sherlock Holmes proves that, I think, rather than with giving a straight historical account of detective fiction, I'm more concerned with helping us think through what we do when we read critically, when we read like fictional detectives, when we read like detectives of fiction and in fiction. And these three questions that I posed right at the beginning of the first video on Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue are what this whole set of videos is really about. You can find a lot of material offering you a straight history of detective fiction online and in books, in videos and in blogs, in learned and in popular writing. I'm not going simply to repeat that material, though I'm certainly not going to ignore it. What would be the point of just repeating it, though? Or rather, I'm trying to investigate what we do when we read suspiciously, like detectives. Detection matters for many reasons, as we've already explored, not least because it can elucidate ethical issues for us, including the differences and similarities between justice and the law. But thinking about reading like detectives also allows us to investigate ourselves and how we interpret the world around us. Now, in this video, I want to introduce Sherlock Holmes and explore where both Holmes and Lee fit into the general history of fictional detectives. I know I said I'm not offering you a history of literary detectives, but it's a good idea to see where texts fit together in terms of chronology. For a considerable portion of the introduction to Sherlock Holmes part, I'll be turning to an account of him by the famous crime novelist P.D. James, a writer who will appear later on this course. I'll be referring back to her account of Sherlock Holmes, in fact, when we get to James's novel An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this again. Suffice it to remind you that we kicked off with the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and that the two main kinds of detective, amateur and professional police detective, arose very early in the history of the genre. Now, there is another kind but I've signalled with a pale mauve box a professional detective who isn't embedded in the police, but who earns their money by working for other agencies. The example I've put on the screen for you is Ralph Henderson in the Notting Hill Mystery. He's a detective for an insurance agency, and you can see that that kind of detective appears as early as 1862, so even before. And then we covered Mary Braddon's Henry Dunbar. It's in the first video on Henry Dunbar, in fact, that we went through the key points of this history screen up to that point. In Henry Dunbar, we found both Mr. Carter, a member of the professional police detective force from Scotland Yard, and also several amateur detectives. I've only written 3 on the screen in front of you. You could include Arthur as well if you wanted, though he's only a suspicious reader. He doesn't actually act on his suspicions, unlike Margaret and Clement. And Laura, in her turn, who I have included on the screen, is a kind of accidental detective. She's rather too stupid a reader of the man she thinks is her father to be very suspicious of him, in fact. She just goes in search of a portrait. And then, passing over several other detectives, all fascinating in their own way, including 2 non-police women professionals, we come to 1887 and the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, as he calls himself. Indeed, we find the King of Bohemia consulting Sherlock Holmes in a scandal in Bohemia. And the next text we'll be reading, Matched by Richard Marsh, is, as we'll quickly see, a clear counterpart and rewriting perhaps of a scandal in Bohemia, but involving the adventures of a decidedly plucky amateur, the redoubtable Judith Lee. As you see from the number of continuations and the length of the series that they're involved in, both Sherlock Holmes and Judith Lee were very popular indeed. Sherlock Holmes is so popular, in fact, that his creator Conan Doyle was begged to produce more, far more than he wanted, 4 novels and 56 short stories. While Judith Lee is by no means as well known now, she was very popular at the time and appeared in 21 short stories, eventually collected together and published in 2 volumes. Now, I want to begin my initial exploration of Sherlock Holmes in history by thinking about a really very well-known text about detective fiction written by the crime writer P.D. James. She introduces her version of Sherlock Holmes with the paragraph you see before you. And in doing this, I'm not just offering an introduction to the character of Sherlock Holmes, but also reflecting on how that character is introduced. In other words, I'm trying to investigate our own readings of this fictional character. The quotation on the screen, as I say, is the very first paragraph of P.D. James's very well-known series of essays. She brought them out very late in her career, just 5 years before she died in November 2014. And it comes from the opening of what is in effect James's first chapter after the introduction. It's called The Tenant of 221B Baker Street and the Parish Priest from Cobhole in Essex. The first 2/3 of the chapter concerns Sherlock Holmes, and the last third, a much sketchier third, concerns G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown. You can see the rhetorical ploy that James is using in this passage. She's telling us why we really need to read the chapter, that in reading it, we're reminding ourselves that through our interest in Sherlock Holmes, we're part of a vast community of readers comprising enthusiasts for detective fiction from all over the world, united by an interest in the unchallenged great detective. We are, in other words, engaging with the top of intellectual independence. Heroic individualism. We're dealing with an intellectual Superman, the champion player of the game. The puzzle. We've already seen detection described as several times already. The detective here is rather like a champion sportsman, but one whose trainers, diet, gym, in fact the whole panoply of social processes that contribute to make a sports star, we never get to see. we're just presented with the idea of their magical greatness, spontaneously and autonomously generated, so it seems. Sherlock Holmes is a star, like these sportsmen. Our job as readers is to be dazzled, intrigued, yes, but so dazzled that we don't think of our own relationship to the dazzling object. Certainly, what's implied here is that if we haven't read Sherlock Holmes, then we really ought to, or we'll be left out of that vast community of readers. Even if we've never read any of the stories he appears in, at least we know what Sherlock Holmes looks like. So we're not totally excluded from the vast community of enthusiasts for detective fiction. We've seen the films and the several TV series. Perhaps we've been to the exhibition that the Museum of London held in the winter of 2014 to 15. We recognize Sherlock Holmes because we've seen the effects of the illustrations to the stories drawn by Sidney Paget on the films and early theatrical versions. And even if we never knew about the early plays about Sherlock Holmes, we will recognize from this still from a film starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, the deer stalker, the magnifying glass, and the calabash pipe that the early film borrowed from the theatre to become Sherlock Holmes's instantly recognizable attributes. They are his logo, his seal, his code. Whether we've read Conan Doyle or not, we think we already know Sherlock Holmes. These attributes are things we can buy at any number of tourist locations in London, so we can become him. He's just like us anyway. He decodes minute clues that people give off about themselves, the traces of the identities that they leave behind them. Or is it people around us who are the mystery? As P.D. James writes, rather tautologously, Sherlock Holmes is not only Victorian, he's our contemporary too. Like so many critics and writers about Sherlock Holmes, James is keen to show how Sherlock Holmes is close to real life. She's quite typical as a historian of Sherlock Holmes in how she points out the man whom Conan Doyle said he used as a model, his own medical teacher at Edinburgh University, Dr. Joseph Bell. Conan Doyle was Bell's assistant on his ward. P.D. James is typical too in then going on to mention Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin, whom Conan Doyle acknowledged was an influence on him. Now the key thing here, I think, is how Sherlock Holmes stories are commonly read as rooted in reality first and in fictional predecessors second. Sherlock Holmes stories seem to invite reading in terms of what we found in our investigation of Henry Dunbar and sensation fiction, proximity and personality. They feel so close to us. They seem a code with an underlying reality, a reality we can access if we crack the code, as if they're chests that can be opened with a key. P.D. James reminds us too, as standard accounts invariably do, of the publishing history of Sherlock Holmes, especially of his early appearances. She tells us how the fiction in which the unchallenged great detective first appeared was A Study in Scarlet, a short novel printed originally in Samuel Beaton's Christmas Annual, which came out in November 1887, costing a shilling, and how the story was so popular it was soon published separately in a single volume in 1888. P.D. James misses out the publication of Conan Doyle's next Sherlock Holmes novel, The Sign of Four, in the Anglo-American Lippincott's magazine. By the way, the same magazine that published Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray a few months later. That's okay, because what we're really interested in on this course is the Sherlock Holmes' first adventure, A Scandal in Bohemia. For James does remind us of how Sherlock Holmes soon found an ideal venue in the high circulation Strand magazine. That's where A Scandal in Bohemia was published. James explains that the Strand and Sherlock Holmes appeared at a time of expanded literacy, by which he means that the Education Act, which made education compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 12, had been passed in 1870 and had by now borne fruit. Society seemed ready for Sherlock Holmes, James seemed to be saying. The upper working and middle classes had leisure now, as well as the reading skills, and she could have said also that they had some spare cash to spend on inessential items like leisure reading. They seemed to like his forays into the forbidden, the horrific even. But it's not really the Strand magazine as a publishing venue that interests James, or most of her critics, in fact. No, the magazine is only a medium that has no substance in itself. It's only a transition point through which a current of reality seems to flow. For besides telling us that Sherlock's roots are in reality an echo of Dr. Joseph Bell, what was also important for P.D. James was the parallelism between Sherlock Holmes, his creator, and his readers. Reality seems to flow directly from the origins of the story to the story's readers. This is a curious way of thinking, don't you think? There is something magical here, a mystical flow between origins and destination. James is pretty clear about it, though. Think what she's implying when she quotes, without naming the source in fact, a letter from Doyle to his mother in 1899. That's well after Sherlock Holmes was an established figure. Doyle is implying in this letter that the readers of Sherlock Holmes were all men, and indeed rather heroic men, exactly the kind who would support the British Empire. A peculiar kind of imperial masculinity is at stake here. And what James doesn't mention is what to us is the problematic nature of this gendering. It's problematic in many ways, but I'll just mention one here. First, what evidence is there that only men read these stories? For a start, James has read of his adventures herself, and we know Agatha Christie admitted in her autobiography that she was influenced by Holmes. And Agatha Christie's fellow Golden Age detective fiction writer Dorothy Sayers wrote several rather learned essays on Holmes between 1928 and 1946. So already he's got 3 women readers. Now, one of the things I want to explore in this course is the variety of resources available to help us read, to investigate reading, to read reading. And the free resource online, the Reading Experience Database, or RED, is one of those very helpful resources. Turning to the Reading Experience Database and searching for evidence of what kind of person read Sherlock Holmes, we find a list of this. The experience of a Welsh miner who used his equivalent of a public library, the local Colliery Institute. It was a dull building, but it offered him an escape into another life. The science fiction of H.G. Wells, the imperial fantasies of Sir Henry Rider Haggard, and the popular short stories of William Wymark Jacobs. The miner has misremembered the author's second initial, I'm afraid. And of course, there's Sherlock Holmes. There's to be deduced from this miner's description of his reading, not least how, while he names the authors, Wells, Rider Haggard, Jacobs, he names a character in the case of Sherlock Holmes. And of course, he is a man, confirming Conan Doyle's and P.D. James's claim. But unsurprisingly, we do find at least one woman reader finding solace or perhaps escape in Sherlock Holmes stories too. Here is Antonia White, the advertising copywriter, modernist novelist and short story writer, and friend of Juna Barnes, writing her diary in the 1930s. The date is not entirely sure. She's certainly reading Sherlock Holmes. Let's return to P.D. James's introductory paragraph about Holmes. I'm struck that the vision of Holmes that James presents is one that the very first story in the strand, the first adventure, the one that we've set on this course, is indeed challenged. Holmes is outwitted in this story. And of course it's a woman, the woman, who challenges and outwits him. I'll return to this later, but what I want to point out is that P.D. James is concerned, like so many histories, to ensure the hegemonic masculinity of Holmes. Even when she calls him an unlikely hero, she points out his relationship to the masculinist interests and fantasies of readers. I shall certainly return to the question of gender in Holmes. I only want to introduce here the detective and to start to raise some of the issues and themes we're pursuing in later videos. Gender, of course, publishing history, proximity and personality, the topical, in other words. But that's enough for now. The next video will start us investigating the form of a scandal in Bohemia and of Matched, and I look forward to seeing you again for that.